The Scarlet Ibis, Part 4, by James Hurst. Daddy, Mama, Doodle, and I were seated at the dining room table, having lunch. It was a hot day with all the windows and doors open in case a breeze should come. In the kitchen, Aunt Nicey was humming softly. After a long silence, Daddy spoke. It's so calm, I wouldn't be surprised if we had a storm this afternoon. I haven't heard a rain frog, said Mama, who believed in signs, as she served the bread around the table. I did, declared Doodle, down in the swamp. He didn't, I said contrarily. You did, eh? Said Daddy, ignoring my denial. I certainly did, Doodle reiterated, scowling at me over the top of his iced tea glass, and we were quiet again. Suddenly, from out of in the yard came a strange croaking noise. Doodle stopped eating with a piece of bread poised ready for his mouth. His eyes popped round like two blue buttons. What's that? He whispered. I jumped up, knocking over my chair, and had reached the door when Mamma called, Pick up the chair, sit down again, and say, Excuse me. By the time I had done this, Doodle had excused himself and had slipped out into the yard. He was looking up into the bleeding tree. It's a great big red bird, he called. The bird croaked loudly again, and Mamma and Daddy came out into the yard. We shaded our eyes with our hands against the hazy glare of the sun and peered up through the still leaves. On the topmost branch, a bird the size of a chicken, with scarlet feathers and long legs, was perched precariously. Its wings hung down loosely, and as we watched the feather drop away and floated slowly down through the green leaves. It's not even frightened of us, Mamma said. It looks tired, Daddy added, or maybe sick. Doodle's hands were clasped at his throat, and I had never seen him stand still so long. What is it? He asked. Daddy shook his head. I don't know. Maybe it's. At that moment, the bird began to flutter, but the wings were uncoordinated, and amid much flapping and a spray of flying feathers, it tumbled down, bumping through the limbs of the bleeding tree and landing at our feet with a thud. Its long, graceful neck jerked twice into an S, then straightened out, and the bird was still. A white veil came over their eyes, and the long white beak unhinged. Its legs were crossed, and its claws-like feet were delicately curved at rest. Even death did not mar its grace, for it lay on the earth like a broken vase of red flowers, and we stood around it, awed by its exotic beauty. It's dead, Mamma said. What is it? Doodle repeated. Go bring me the bird book, said Daddy. I ran into the house and brought back the bird book. As we watched, Daddy thumbed through the pages. It's a Scarlet Ibis, he said, pointing to a picture. It lives in the tropics, South America to Florida. A storm must have brought it here. Sadly, we all looked back at the bird. A Scarlet Ibis? How many miles did I travel to die like this? In our yard beneath the bleeding tree. Let's finish lunch, Mamma said, nudging us back toward the dining room. I'm not hungry, said Doodle, and he knelt down beside the Ibis. We got peach cobbler for dessert, Mamma tempted from the doorway. Doodle remained kneeling. I'm going to bury it. Don't you dare touch him, Mamma warned him. There's no telling what disease he might have. All right, said Doodle. I won't. Daddy, Mamma, and I went back to the dining room table. But we watched Doodle through the open door. He took out a piece of string from his pocket, and without touching the ibis, he looped one end around its neck, slowly, while singing softly, Shall we gather at the river? He carried the bird around to the front yard and dug a hole in the flower garden next to the petunia bed. Now, we were watching him through the front window, but he didn't know it. His awkwardness at digging the hole with a shovel, whose handle was twice as long as he was, made us laugh, and we covered our mouths with our hands so we wouldn't hear. When Doodle came into the dining room, he found us seriously eating our cobbler. He was pale and lingered just inside the screen door. Did you get the Scarlet Ibis buried? Asked Daddy. Doodle didn't speak but nodded his head. Go wash your hands, and then you can have some peach cobbler, said Mamma. I'm not hungry, he said. Dead birds is bad luck, said Aunt Nancy, poking her head from the kitchen door, especially red dead birds. As soon as I had finished eating, Doodle and I hurried off the Horsehead Landing. Time was short, and Doodle still had a long way to go if he was going to keep up with the other boys when he started school. The sun, gilded with the yellow cast of autumn, still burned fiercely, but the dark green woods through which we passed were shady and cool. When we reached the landing, Doodle said he was too tired to swim, so we got into a skiff and floated down the creek with the tide. Far off in the marsh, a rail was scolding, and over on the beach, locusts were singing in the myrtle trees. Doodle did not speak and kept his head turned away, letting one hand trail limply in the water. After we had drifted a long way, I put the oars in place and made Doodle row back against the tide. Black clouds began to gather in the southwest, and he kept watching them, trying to pull the oars a little faster. When we reached Horsehead Landing, lightning was playing across half the sky, and thunder roared out, hiding even the sound of the sea. The sun disappeared, and darkness descended almost like night. Flocks of marsh crows flew by, heading inland to their roosting trees, and two egrets, squawking, arose from the oyster rock shallows and careened away. Doodle was both tired and frightened, and when he stepped from the skiff, he collapsed onto the mud, sending an armada of fiddler crabs rustling off into the marsh grass. I helped him up, and as he wiped the mud off his trousers, he smiled at me ashamedly. He had failed, and we both knew it. So we started back home, racing the storm. We never spoke. What are words that can solder cracked pride? But I knew. He was watching me, watching for a sign of mercy. The lightning was near now, and from fear, he walked so close behind me, kept stepping on my heels. The faster I walked, the faster he walked, so I began to run. The rain was coming roaring through the pines, and then, like a bursting Roman candle, a gum tree ahead of us was shattered by a bolt of lightning. When the deafening peal of thunder had died, and in a moment before the rain arrived, I heard Doodle, who had fallen behind, cry out, "Brother, brother, don't leave me, don't leave me." The knowledge that Doodle's and my plans had come to naught was bitter, and that streak of cruelty within me awakened. I ran as fast as I could, leaving him far behind with a wall of rain dividing us. The drops stung my face like nettles, and the wind flared the wet, glistening leaves of the bordering trees. Soon I could hear his voice no more. I had run too far before I became tired, and the flood of childish spite evanesced as well. I stopped and waited for Doodle. The sound of rain was everywhere, but the wind had died, and it fell straight down into parallel paths, like ropes hanging from the sky. As I waited, I peered through the downpour, but no one came. Finally, I went back and found him huddled beneath a red nightshade bush beside the road. He was sitting on the ground, his face buried in his arms, which were resting on his drawn-up knees. "Let's go, Doodle," I said. He didn't answer, so I placed my hand on his forehead and lifted his head limply. He fell backward onto the earth. He had been bleeding from the mouth, and his neck and the front of his shirt were stained a brilliant red. "Doodle, Doodle," I cried, shaking him, but there was no answer. But the ropey rain, he lay very awkwardly, with his head thrown far back, making his vermilion neck appear unusually long and slim. His little legs, bent sharply at knees, had never been before seemed so fragile, so thin. I began to weep, and the tear-blurred vision in red before me looked very familiar. "Doodle!" I screamed above the pounding storm, and threw my body to the earth above his. For a long, long time, it seemed forever, I lay there crying, sheltering my fallen Scarlet Ibis from the heresy of rain. This is the end of part 4 of the Scarlet Ibis.